My stepson ordered me to bow down to his biological father for taking his place. I drained the accounts, closed every card, and delivered him to his dad along with the bills. It wasn't the victory he imagined. Don't forget to subscribe and share your experiences below. Let's get started. You're not my real dad, you never were. If you want to stay part of this family, you need to admit that and apologize to my real father. That's what Josh told me. No hesitation. No flinch. He stood in the doorway of my own living room like a prosecutor delivering a verdict, his arms folded across his chest, his jaw tight, and I just stared at him. I stared at this boy, my stepson. 18 years old now, broad-shouldered, still with the acne that made him look younger than he wanted to be. A boy I had raised from the age of 10. A boy I had poured years of work, money, and love into. And now he was demanding that I kneel before a man who had abandoned him, that I apologize for taking his place. The words didn't just hurt, they hollowed me out. I met his mother, Hannah, in Memphis, back when Josh was still a child. She was working the counter of a diner I stopped in after a construction shift. Her hair tied back, her hands rough from years of doing it all alone. She had that weary beauty of someone who'd been through hell but hadn't quite surrendered to it. When we first started talking, I thought she was just lonely. But the more I listened, the more I realized. She was exhausted. Exhausted from raising a boy while the man who gave him life lived states away in Texas. Drifting from job to job, woman to woman, excuse to excuse. His name was Tom. That was all I knew at first. A shadow, a story. Hannah would mention him with a sharpness in her voice, the way someone speaks about a wound that never really healed. Tom was the kind of man who could promise the world over the phone but couldn't show up for a single birthday. He called Josh every once in a while, slurring his words, blaming distance, blaming money, blaming the bad luck that always seemed to dog him. But he never blamed himself. So when I stepped in, it wasn't to replace anyone. It was to fill a hole that should never have been there. The first year with Hannah and Josh was awkward. He didn't know what to make of me. He'd look at me across the dinner table like I was just passing through, like one day I'd vanished the same way his father had. I didn't push him. I showed up, consistently, patiently. Football practice? I was in the bleachers. Parent-teacher conferences? I sat in the front row, notebook in hand. Doctor's appointments? I took the day off work, sat in the waiting room, held his hand when he was scared. When the coach said he needed new gear, it was me who paid for it. When his grades slipped, I hired the tutors. When summer rolled around, I scraped together money for camps, even though it meant working overtime, picking up shifts no one else wanted. Every piece of his childhood that should have had his father there, it was me instead. And I told myself it was worth it. That one day he would understand the difference between words and actions. Between a man who dropped in like a phantom and a man who built a life brick by brick. But standing there in my living room, Josh's words carved through me like glass. You need to apologize to my real dad for taking his place. His real dad. I thought about the nights I came home bone-tired, back screaming from hauling steel beams in August heat, and still managed to sit at the kitchen table with him, helping him with algebra. I thought about the thousands of dollars poured into his future, the countless hours of my life that had revolved around his needs, his dreams, his comfort. And I thought about the man he wanted me to apologize to. Tom. Tom, who had vanished for years at a time. Tom, who couldn't be bothered to send a birthday card most years. Tom, who only existed in tall tales and excuses. But in Josh's eyes, Tom wasn't the ghost. I was. And the irony? I should have seen it coming. The cracks had been there for months, maybe years, but I ignored them. Little comments. Little comparisons. Dad said when he was my age. Or, you're not as strong as my dad, he could have fixed that faster. Always said with a smirk, like he wanted to test me, to remind me that no matter what I did, I wasn't blood. I swallowed those words. I told myself he was just a kid, that kids lash out, that maybe he needed to keep that fantasy alive. Because that's all Tom ever was, a fantasy. A picture Josh carried in his mind of a man who could have been, who should have been, but never was. But the fantasy was stronger than my years of reality. And Hannah, God bless her, she didn't help. She would never contradict Josh when he made those comments. She'd just stay quiet, staring at her plate, or she'd change the subject. Maybe she thought silence was neutral, but to me that silence was a knife. It told me that she wasn't willing to fight for my place in her son's life. That deep down, even she thought I was standing in another man's shadow. I should have confronted it earlier. I should have demanded respect before it got to this point. But I didn't. I kept pouring myself out, hoping one day Josh would pour something back in return. Instead, he gave me this, an ultimatum. If I wanted to stay, I had to kneel. I had to acknowledge a ghost as the true father and apologize for daring to exist in his place. I can't explain what it felt like. It wasn't just betrayal. It was erasure. 8 years of being there, gone in a sentence. 8 years of sacrifice dismissed like trash. I wanted to shout. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and force him to see the truth. That his real dad had chosen absence, that I had chosen presence. But when I looked at him, I knew it wouldn't matter. His mind was already made up. His loyalty belonged to the father who abandoned him, not the man who raised him. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit for years. Love without respect isn't love at all. The servitude. And maybe I had been a servant in my own home, convincing myself I was a father. It was 2 months before Josh's graduation when the ghost finally returned. Tom. The man I was supposed to apologize to. The man Josh called his real dad. He showed up in Memphis like a traveling salesman, all charm and promises, carrying stories he'd rehearsed in motel mirrors. He came in with gifts under his arm, laughter on his tongue, and that magnetic pull some men have, the kind that blinds people to the fact that they've never stayed. Josh melted the second he saw him. I watched it happen in real time. One moment my stepson was a sullen teenager, shrugging at me, brushing off my questions about college applications. The next, he was a boy again, his eyes shining, his shoulders loose, drinking in every word Tom poured out. Tom spun his tales effortlessly. I've always thought about you, son. Every single day. It broke my heart not to be here. His voice cracked just enough to sound real, but not enough to betray the truth. He talked about jobs that had kept him away, about dreams he'd chased for Josh's sake, about mistakes he was finally ready to make right. Josh believed every syllable. Suddenly, I was no longer the man who had stood in the rain at football practice. I was no longer the man who worked overtime to pay for tutors when his grades slipped. I was no longer the man who knew the name of every doctor he'd ever seen, every allergy, every fear he tried to hide. No, overnight I became nothing, placeholder, a stand-in. And Tom? Tom became the hero who had finally come home. I clenched my teeth until my jaw ached. I stayed silent when Josh started calling him Dad, again with that warmth I had begged for years to hear. I didn't cause a scene when Hannah smiled too widely, as though this sudden reappearance could erase a decade of abandonment. I kept quiet because I believed, foolishly, that time would reveal the truth, that Josh would eventually see the difference between words and actions, between a man who promises and a man who provides. But in the meantime, I paid. I paid for everything. For his graduation, I bought him a suit. $600 I didn't have, but I told myself he deserved to feel like a man stepping into the world. I paid for the party, renting out the venue, covering the food, the drinks, the decorations, because Hannah said it mattered, because Josh said his friends expected it. I signed him up for expensive college prep courses, the kind that promised to raise his scores and open more doors. I spent nights filling out forms, double-checking deadlines, making sure nothing slipped through the cracks. And when Hannah said Josh needed a car, something reliable to get him to classes and work, I signed the papers for installments, knowing it would chain me for years. Every bill had my name on it. Every sacrifice drained my account, my time, my body. And what did I hear in return? It's not your business. Tom will handle it. That's what Josh told me when I offered help with his applications. He brushed me off with a smirk, repeating the same line again and again. My real dad will take care of it. But of course, Tom never did. When it came time to actually pay for those prep courses, my card. When it came time to keep the insurance current on the car, my paycheck. When it came time to fund the graduation party Josh bragged about to his friends. My savings. Tom brought shiny gifts. A watch. A new phone. Empty tokens that glittered under the lights and made Josh's eyes widen. But the foundation, the roof, the food, the future, that was me. Yet in Josh's eyes, Tom was the father. I was just the sponsor. Hannah didn't help. She let it happen. She let her son lean into the fantasy, let him treat me like I was disposable. Whenever I tried to confront her, she'd say, "He's just excited. Don't take it personally. He needs his father. Needs his father." And what was I? Every night I lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, replaying the day's little cuts. Josh brushing me off. Hannah staying silent. Tom smiling like a king, as though he hadn't spent a decade hiding in Texas. I told myself to endure it. That graduation was temporary, that once the glitter faded, the truth would shine. But with each dollar I spent, with each dismissal I swallowed, I felt myself disappearing from my own home. And then came the final insult. One evening, I walked into the living room while Josh was on the phone with Tom. He didn't notice me at first. He was laughing, his voice light in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Yeah, Dad. I knew you'd come through. You always do. You always do." That was the moment something inside me cracked. Tom had vanished for years, leaving nothing but Hannah's bitterness and a boy's empty questions. I had stayed. I had carried the weight. And yet in Josh's heart, in his words, Tom was the savior who always came through. I stood in that room invisible, a man erased by the return of a ghost. And that's when I knew this wasn't going to fix itself. Time wasn't going to reveal the truth. The truth had already been revealed. In Josh's eyes, I was not the father. I never had been. I was the man who paid, the man who filled in, the man who could be discarded when the real one finally decided to show up with a smile and a story. And if that's all I was, then something would have to change. It was a Tuesday evening when everything finally snapped. I had just come home from work, still in my boots, the dust of the job clinging to my shirt. The house smelled of takeout. Josh was sprawled on the couch, phone in hand, laughing at something on the screen. Hannah was in the kitchen, her back turned, moving quietly, as if afraid to step into the tension that had been building for months. I set my keys on the counter, glanced at the pile of unopened mail, bills, insurance statements, credit card reminders, all with my name in bold letters. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, when Josh looked up at me, and he said it. "You need to go to my dad and apologize for taking his place. Then maybe I'll respect you again." I froze. My stomach dropped as if the floor had given way beneath me. My pulse hammered in my ears. I stared at him, this boy I had raised, clothed, fed, defended, pushed through school, carried through life. His eyes didn't waver. He wasn't joking. He wasn't lashing out. He meant it. Apologize. To Tom. The man who had abandoned him. The man who left Hannah crying in a half-paid apartment. The man who never bought a single pair of shoes. Never sat through a single school conference. Never once stayed for the hard nights when fevers spiked or grades collapsed. Apologize for existing in his absence. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. But I only stood there, frozen, my hands curling into fists at my sides. Hannah turned, her mouth half open, as if she might say something. But she didn't. She stayed silent, her eyes flicking from her son to me, the same way she always had when Josh put me beneath his real dad. That silence spoke louder than anything. I swallowed hard. "Is that what you really think of me?" I asked. Josh shrugged, his smirk cutting deeper than any words. "You're not my father. You never will be. Respect belongs to my real dad. Not you. 8 years. Gone." I didn't answer. I didn't argue. I just walked past him, past Hannah, into our bedroom, and shut the door. That night, I lay awake beside her. She shifted, sighed, whispered something about him being young, about not taking it seriously. But I knew. I had felt the weight of his words, the steadiness in his tone. He meant it, and something inside me hardened. The next morning, before the sun was up, I made my decision. I drove to the bank before work, closed the joint account, transferred every cent into my own. I called the insurance company, canceled the add-ons tied to Josh's name. The health plan, the dental coverage, the extras I had been paying for since the day Hannah and I married, gone. I called the phone provider, cut off the line that gave him unlimited talk, text, and data, the lifeline he used to call the man who had abandoned him. Then I called the college payment center, told them to cancel the installments. I was no longer responsible. I canceled the car insurance too. The car that bore my signature on the loan, the one I'd been making monthly payments on so he could drive to practices, dates, parties. Without my coverage, it was nothing more than a hunk of metal waiting for repossession. Each call was a release. Each signature, each confirmation, each "are you sure?" met with my steady, unwavering voice. Yes, cancel it. By the end of the day, my hands no longer shook. My chest felt light, not heavy. For the first time in years, I wasn't bending under the weight of debts I didn't owe. When I came home, I didn't go inside right away. I stayed in the driveway watching the house. The lights glowed warm through the windows. Inside was the boy who had spat in my face, the woman who had let him. I thought about walking away right then, driving off and never returning. But no, they needed to see what choices cost. So I went inside. Josh was in the kitchen, still in his football hoodie, scrolling his phone. Hannah looked up from the sink, sensing the storm before it broke. "Josh," I said evenly, "get your things. You're going to your dad's." He frowned, confused. "What?" I set a folder on the counter. Thick, heavy, stuffed with papers. "These are the bills. The car loan, the insurance, the utilities, everything you've been living on. Since your real father is back, he can deal with it now." His phone slipped from his hand, clattering against the counter. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious in my life," Hannah gasped, stepping forward. "Wait. What are you doing?" I looked at her, my voice cold. "Exactly what your son asked. He said I'm not his father. He said I need to apologize for taking Tom's place." "Fine. Let Tom have his place. Let him pay the price that comes with it." Josh's face twisted, half fury, half disbelief. "You can't just cut me off like that. You've always—" I cut him off. "I was never your father, remember? Those were your words. Now I'm listening." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Hannah pressed her hand to her mouth. Josh's eyes darted wildly, like a trapped animal searching for escape. I didn't flinch. I handed him the folder. "Your real dad can handle it now. Pack your things. I'll drive you there." The ride to Tom's place was silent. Josh sat in the passenger seat, shoulders stiff, eyes glassy. He didn't speak. Neither did I. When we pulled up to Tom's small rental house on the edge of town, I parked the car, stepped out, and dropped the folder onto the porch. Josh followed, his voice finally breaking. "You can't just dump me here." I looked him dead in the eye. "You chose him. You wanted him. Now he's yours. Every bill, every responsibility, every consequence. From this day forward, he's your father. Not me." I left him there, standing in the doorway of the man he'd elevated above me, clutching the folder that weighed more than he ever imagined. And as I drove away, I felt the strangest thing. Not guilt, not regret, relief, because for the first time, I was free of the chains of being a father without a father's respect. A week later, my phone rang. It was Hannah. Her voice cracked before she even said my name. "He's gone," she whispered, sobbing into the line. "Tom, he vanished. Again." I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let the silence hang. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't even angry. I had known this was coming the moment I dropped Josh off at that peeling front porch. The truth was simple. Tom never wanted the weight of being a father. He wanted the performance, the applause, the fleeting recognition without the burden of bills, responsibility, or sacrifice. For a week, he played his part. Promises, big words, that same rehearsed charm that had reeled Josh in and made Hannah soften her eyes. But promises don't pay rent. Promises don't keep the lights on. Promises don't cover car loans or tuition or insurance. And so, as always, Tom disappeared. Hannah's sobs rattled through the phone, but I felt nothing. Not pity. Not sympathy. Not even satisfaction. Only a cold confirmation of what I had always known. You can't build a life on the back of a ghost. 2 days later, Josh showed up on my porch. He didn't knock. He didn't call first. I found him sitting on the steps when I pulled into the driveway after work. His shoulders slumped, his face pale, his hands shaking as though he had just come back from war. When he saw me, he stood too quickly, nearly tripping over himself. His voice cracked. I was wrong. 3 words. Just 3. But they were years too late. I didn't speak at first. I studied him. This boy I had raised, who had spat in my face, who had demanded I apologize to a man who had abandoned him, who had chosen fantasy over flesh, promises over presence. Now he stood before me, trembling, the fantasy shattered, the promises broken. Tom's gone, I asked flatly. He swallowed, nodded. Yeah, he said he'd handle everything, but then he just left. No money, no calls, nothing. His eyes were glassy, desperate. I didn't know what it meant. All those bills, the car, the insurance, the college. He promised, but he never. His voice broke into a sob. I thought he'd be different this time. I let the silence stretch until it became unbearable. Finally, I spoke. This is what responsibility looks like. This is the cost of believing in words without actions. He stepped closer, his hands trembling. Please, I didn't understand. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean what I said. But I shook my head. You meant it. You looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't your father. You demanded I apologize to the man who abandoned you. You believed his fantasy because it was easier than facing the truth. And now you're here because that fantasy collapsed. His tears streamed freely now. He dropped to his knees on the porch, clutching at my leg like a drowning man reaching for anything to hold on to. Please, I'm begging you. I'll do anything. Just don't leave me like this. Please. Inside, I could hear Hannah's muffled sobs. She had followed him here, lingering in the shadows, afraid to face me directly. I looked down at him. This boy I had carried for nearly a decade, who had called me nothing but a replacement, a mistake, a man in another's shadow. And I realized something bitter and final. His begging wasn't about me. It wasn't about love or recognition or respect. It was about survival. He wasn't repenting because he saw my worth. He was begging because he couldn't carry the weight Tom had dumped on him. And that difference mattered. I pulled my leg free, stepped back, and let his hands fall to the wood of the porch. No, I said coldly. Love without respect is slavery. And I will never be a slave again. His face twisted in agony, his sobs breaking the still night air. Hannah finally stepped forward, her voice shaking. Please don't do this to him. He's just a boy. He didn't know. I turned on her, my voice sharp as a blade. He knew enough to use my money. He knew enough to enjoy the roof I paid for, the car I signed for, the future I sacrificed for. He knew enough to demand respect for a man who never gave him anything. He knew enough to spit in my face. Don't tell me he didn't know. Her tears flowed, her shoulders shaking. He was just confused. Tom. He tricked him. I stepped closer, my voice low, steady. No. He chose Tom. He chose the man who abandoned him over the man who stayed. He made his choice. And now he has to live with it. Josh's sobs grew weaker, his body folding into itself, crumpled on my porch like a discarded child. For the first time, he looked small. Not just young. Small. I didn't move. I didn't reach for him. Instead, I opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. The sound of his sobs echoed through the wood, muffled but sharp enough to pierce the silence. Hannah stayed outside with him for a long time, whispering, begging, pleading. Eventually, the sounds faded. When I looked out the window hours later, they were gone. Days passed. The house was quieter than it had been in years. No slamming doors. No sarcastic comments. No dismissive smirks. Just silence. But silence doesn't erase what's been said. A week later, Josh came again. He didn't kneel this time. He didn't cry. He just stood on the porch, his face hollow, his voice small. "I was wrong," he said again. I opened the door, met his eyes, and nodded. "Yes, you were." And then I shut the door. Because regret spoken after the fact doesn't rebuild what's been burned. Because respect isn't something begged for when life falls apart. It's something lived, day after day, in how you treat the people who carry you. I had carried him long enough. Now he would learn to walk on his own, or fall on his own. As for me, I had found my answer. Love without respect turns you into a sponsor. And I was done sponsoring someone else's child at the cost of my own soul. So I ask you, was I wrong? Was I cruel for walking away when they finally realized the cost of their choices? Or was it the only way left to teach them the truth? That respect has a price, and I was done paying it?